Okay, thank you everybody for joining tonight's session on REFramework, Debugging Workflow, Analyzer, Validation, Developer Series. So if you want to go to the next slide. So I'm Diana Gray. I'm the Community Marketing Manager for the Americas. And tonight we have Chris Bolin, who's a Senior Analyst for Mary Kay. He's been giving the sessions for REFramework. And if you go to the next slide. Just a reminder to everybody that these sessions are being put on by the MVPs in America, Canada, and the US and Latin America. And that we definitely want you guys to contribute any topics you'd like to hear about in the future. This is an ongoing series that we're doing, and we'll focus on certain topics and then we'll move off onto different topics. And we're hoping, that you guys let us know what those are. So I will be putting my email address, which you can see here, diana.gray@uipath.com. If you have any types of topics that you'd like to hear, please let us know. And for this, if you would just keep yourself on mute until Chris gets going. And then if you have any questions, please let us know or put that in chat. That would be great. So if you go to the next slide. So this is the last in this series of REFramework. We have all these recorded. I'll put all that information in the chat as well. And I will also let you know where the America event website is in case you're interested in taking any of our future series. And if you go to the last slide. So the series that's happening right now is called UiPath Apps. It's actually tomorrow night. We'll be on our second session. And again, we're running continuous series. So if there's anything you missed, if you just let me know, I can send you the recording or we can run a topic again. So, our whole goal is to make sure that you guys have what you want. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Chris.
Sure, thanks. So I'm gonna divert, not divert, we're gonna get into debugging, but I want to talk about something else prior. I've been getting a lot of questions about, and I want to talk about the project lifecycle. What's your lifecycle? A best practice would do what Mary Kay does, and maybe that would give you some ideas about how you set up your processes, your automations, how you get from a business team needing something down to the final steps. So I kind of threw this together today just to outline kind of what Mary Kay does. And I wanted to get this out of the way because I've gotten, that's bad grammar. My mama would kill me. I've received a lot of questions about how we start our projects and things like that. So I'm not going to go into a lot of detail. There's a lot of detail in this process, but I'm just going to go to high level overview. So the first thing we do at Mary Kay is someone approaches us with a project. We first determine either through, is it the security? Is it something that you want a developer seeing vicariously? Is it something you want a business analyst? And sometimes that business analyst and the developer are all the same person. Should it be automated? Can it be automated? If it can't be automated, it's nothing wrong with saying this is not something that a bot can do. There are some things that a bot cannot do. The next step we do is we have what we call a define phase. And that's where we sit with the process teams. Okay, someone comes to you with an automation idea. Who relies on the product of that process for that team? What are their upstream dependencies, and who do they rely upon to get that process into their department, to fulfill that process? Because that's who you want to be on the project team. You don't want to just work with the people that are doing the process. You want to make sure that you've covered off the front end and the back end, and you want to have a representative from both those ends on the process team so everybody's on the same page. And this is very critical if you're doing what we call cross-functional processes. At Mary Kay, we've moved away from simple task-centric automations where we're automating just something that one person does on their desktop or just one department does. We are automating an end-to-end process. It starts at some point. That whole process starts at one place and it ends at one place. And we have automation. We have a series of automations that they touch 7 different departments in carrying out that task. So we want to make sure that we have the right people on our business, on our teams. We want to make sure we have working instructions. And I don't know, and I'm sure there's some out there, I've never experienced, I should say, an organization that does not have documented process instructions. We call them disaster recovery documents. Some people call them business continuity documents. It's a series of steps for that process, with sometimes they come with screenshots. And they're very important when you're building, because then you know how that process works. And you, especially if you're the developer and you have a business analyst on the front end, you're able to see that process, where you click, what you do next, things like that. Shadowing is where we will have the developer, especially on a more complex process, sit with the business team and watch what they do. Because when you're doing a process, you're a business team person and you're doing a process, it may be a process that's been in place for 10 years or 5 years. And you just know that when the application does this, you click here. To you, originally, when you learned that process, it was an exception to the rule. And as you've continued to do that process yourself, it's no longer exception, it's just the process. When you're a developer, when you're trying to put something on automation, shadowing is important, because then we can see what you don't feel is an exception, what we know will be an exception. So it's part of that whole exception planning process and how you're going to build those exceptions into your automations. PDD is a process design document, project design document. I'm sure everybody does one of these. UiPath best practice is to complete a PDD. You can find a static template-based PDD from UiPath on their documents. Test data, very important to have test data, not only for development, but also for developer testing. When you get into user acceptance testing, then you will have a new set of data. You don't want to use the same set of data you have for developer testing and that you're using in UAT, because that UAT test data may be something different and newer that you didn't experience during developer testing. So you want to have test data. You want to have test data before you start developing your build. The other thing in here is flow charts. Most process design documents, PDDs, ask that you put a flow chart of what the business process is now, how that business does that process manually. And then you want to do another flow chart of how the bot handles that process, because part of that process, that flow chart are going to change. You're going to gain some efficiencies, and you're going to have to maybe do some different based on exceptions and things like that. So you want to have during that initial phase, that define phase, you want to build a flow chart of how that business does their process. Then when you get into development, you're using your work instructions, your flow chart, your notes from shadowing, if you shadowed, and you're going to decide, all right, am I using an REFramework? Am I using a linear or a transactional REFramework? Am I going to use queues? What's my global handler? How many times do I want it to abort if I run into an unknown exception? What is my exception planning that business really doesn't know is exception planning, but to a bot, it is exception planning? Have I already built code that I can reuse in this automation and just kind of tweak a little bit? Do I have a library that I want to go into the library and use some of that code in this automation? Remember, don't reinvent the wheel each time. And then you go into your developer testing. That's when you're testing, you're debugging with real data in your non-production environment for both the application that you're using, if it's available, and your orchestrator, if it's available in non-prod environment with a non-prod bot. And then user acceptance testing. We usually, depending on the automation, the complexity of the automation, user acceptance testing can take up to 2 weeks. Sometimes we have user acceptance testing that takes a month, just depending on the frequency of the automation, the complexity, how much data, what variables in the data. We want to make sure that the user is able to see what the outputs and you're able to experience the inputs. And then we want to make sure that that user team, that business team that you originally developed here, you want to do a demo for them. You want to have them all sign off. Everybody's on the same page. This is doing what we thought we told you we wanted to do. This is it. And then you put it in production, deploy it into production, and you complete your technical design document, which is a list of your packages, runtimes, and things like that, the name of it. And then you're in hypercare. Hypercare can usually last, depending on the complexity, 2 weeks. Sometimes it's 6 weeks. And hypercare just basically means that the whole business team, whether you're using a system admin team to do your deployments or whatever it might be, everybody in that technical side, including the developer and the business analyst, if that's not the same person, if there's a problem with that automation, that's a priority for you. And you can go in and change that, and it's redeployed into test and retested and things like that. So that's hypercare. Hypercare, once hypercare is done, it's in production, it should be running smoothly. You should have very few faults. If you followed a process, you built your automation robustly, and you've got the documentation, then your process should have very few faults unless something changes in your environment. And that kind of ties into debugging. So let's just get into that. Debugging. I built a little automation on a linear framework that I'm going to read, and it's reading what we call sample superstore data. If you've ever worked with Tableau, you know Tableau has a pretty large data set that you can use for testing and learning. So we're going to do that. The automation I built is going to read that data. We're going to show you different things to look for when you debug, how you kick off a debug in either a linear or REFramework. So we'll just get into that right now. You don't want to see my email. You want to see my screen. All right, linear framework. And in this linear framework, I'm just reading superstore data. It's just one data table. And I've got that data table defined in my config file, the location of that data table. And I've got that defined in this process state. So I've built within my process state, I've built a code segment coming up here to the new, like we've talked about. We build in a code segment and we drag it from our common folder. In this case, I use a common folder because this is not something I have in a library. And I pulled it into my common folder and I drug it over into here. I tied out my arguments for my config. And so here we go. Excel application scope. One thing you want to remember when using Excel application scope, very important, is you want to always uncheck the visible. And I'm going to tell you why. Excel caches dynamically. Excel has limited cache. Your cache clears when you close your Excel spreadsheet. If you have too many Excel spreadsheets open, your cache is filling and Excel will disconnect from your bot. So you want to always check it visible and make sure it says not visible. And then you always want to check read only. If you're just going to read this data and you're not going to manipulate the data that you're reading, you're not going to go back into the same spreadsheet and add data to different columns or totals or something like that, you want to check read only on your data set when you're working with Excel application scope. Another thing that you want to be sure, and I'm just going to mention this because you'll probably run into it when you're using an append range within an Excel application scope, you're going to get some what we call Excel garbage. If you've ever coded before in any type of environment, you know what Excel garbage is. You can't see it on the spreadsheet, the bot can. So if you ever run into Excel garbage and you can't figure out because you tried to filter out blank data sets and they're still there because the bot sees something there, reach out to me and Diane will put my email address in the chat. You can reach out to me and I will show you the code to get rid of Excel garbage. We're not going to go into that here. So I've read my range. I just call it a simple DT. Not best practice. You want to be a little bit more specific than this, but we're in close and I shouldn't have time. All right. So there's two ways that I check and make sure my data set was read by my bot. Is I'm going to, and I will take and delete this later. I'm going to put an output data table, bring in my DT, just create a quick text and log message with the text. This is something I just want to make sure my bot's reading my data table. And I will delete this before I put this in any type of testing or production because this is ancillary, it's unneeded, eats up a lot of memory, but it's important to me as I'm building. And then I just do in a couple of other things here that we're going to show during debug. All right. So when we debug, we want to put in some toggle points. We want to make the bot stop in the debug mode, and we want to look at the panel, and we want to see what's in that panel. When you're debugging, make sure you're cognizant of your scope levels. So for example, DT The bottom level is Superstore, which is my name of my automation. Then I have a sequence, which is this guy, and this guy would normally be labeled. I just threw it together today. And then I have this do right here. So that's going to be important. Keep that in mind as we go into debug, that we're going to see different behaviors based on the scope that we're looking at. Okay. And then down here, I kept these out of scope. Okay. And I'll show you the differences in there. So let's start. Let's just we're just going to put a toggle. You're going to right click on that. And you're just going to toggle a breakpoint. Okay. And then we can toggle a breakpoint on the date. You can toggle as many breakpoints as you want. We're just going to toggle a breakpoint on everything. And I will show you how to take those off when we're done. We're going to run this in debug mode. I'm just going to click debug. You're going to have an orange panel open up. At least mine's orange. I started it from the wrong place. Sorry, guys. Hold on. I need to start it from main. I'm going to start my debug. And it's going to go until it hits a breakpoint. All right. So it's hit our first breakpoint, our first toggle breakpoint. And you can see that it's reading all the variables. So you can see when the bot even enters into this sequence, it already knows all the variables you have set up. Okay. It's not reading them step by step. It's taking an overview and reading everything, and then it goes in and processes. Very important to keep in mind. You can see that all the variables are here. Okay. You can see furniture DT down here is null. It's empty. This text coming from this is null. It's empty. But what we want to look at is, since we've got this read range, we want to see what the bot's capturing in our data table. And you can see there's really nothing there. There's nothing telling us what's in our data table, because remember our scope levels. Your data table here is set to do. Okay. It's not set to here. It's within this do loop. I mean, this do container. So what we want to do is we want to step into that. Or step out. Hold on. I got too many breakpoints. There we go. Step out. Step out until I highlight my do. Okay. Now you can see my DT is populated. I have data in my DT. We just hit the pencil here, and you can see a sample of what that data is. It's not going to list all of your data because of time and because of space, but you can see a sample of that data of what's in your data set that you're reading. Okay. Now this data set has about 1,400, I think that's wrong. I think it's 999 rows, and I think 27 columns. So this is just a sample. And each time you see a comma, that's a new column. This is just in text, plain text. So a comma is a new column. Okay. You can see that my today's date, which is also in this do, is now not 1/1/1900. It is 10/10/2022 at 5:23:31 my time. You can see, however, furniture DT is still empty because furniture DT is not in my do. All right. So I want to step over that. Or there we go. Step out. Sorry. Now I get to my furniture DT. Okay. And you can see my furniture DT is my DT, which is here, is still populated. My furniture DT is still blank. When you're working with data sets and you're working with filters, data outputs, and they're not in a do, they're going to be tied to your sequence. So if we step out, let me get back out to my sequence, you can see my furniture DT is now populated. And I can see that I did a filter for just furniture items out of the sample Superstore data. And it's showing me just a sample of those items. There's a lot more than 44 rows, but it's showing me that it's capturing the information as I have told it to within my filter wizard. Now, let's say sometimes your column heading's wrong, or someone fat fingers a column heading or something along that lines. This is where you'll find that you're not, these are your column headings. This is where you'll find something's missing, something didn't come through right. You're going to find that in your filter data table. Now, if your filters or any other type of data set or anything like that is outside of an Excel application scope. If I had moved this up into the do, I would be able to see it when I saw this and this and this. But I purposely took it out of that so you all can see that when you do take it out of the Excel application scope, it's tied to your primary, your lowest level sequence, okay? And here we can sign our no do. That's today's date. It's right here. Today's date here and today's date here, okay? Now, if I want to go down, if I continue to step into, it's going to take me all the way back to the beginning. All right. Now, let's say we're running a test sequence. There it goes. It released. Let's see, I'm running one of these guys, and I've got my test workflow template, which I use all the time. And test workflow template is going to be set. It's going to default to have your configuration, your initial all settings in here. Okay. And I want to test this guy in my test template. Now, keep in mind when I'm debugging my test template, I'm not going to debug here. Okay. I'm going to right click on that test guy here and debug him here. Okay. If I hit debug here, it's going to start debugging the entire automation again. All right. The other thing you can do is if you want to run, let me round out my arguments here because the orange is bugging me. If you want to run your test template, you're not going to run it when you're going to drop down, you're going to run the file. You're not going to hit run. You're going to run the file. If you hit this run, it's going to run your entire automation. If you're using a test template, you're going to run the file. Okay. And here's that. Down here, you can see back into our automation. You can see this guy, this output data table. I brought in my data table and it's coming out as a text. I'm doing a quick log message and you can see a sample of that data table here. Again, you're not going to see the entire data table. You're just going to see a sample. It's the same thing you're going to see in the debug locals panel. You can see it down here. But again, make sure you take this out if it's not critical to your automation, because you want your automation to be efficient. And this eats up time and it eats up space. So if you don't need it, don't put it. Now, that's not to say don't put log messages in. Put log messages into your automation where there's a critical page juncture, a calculation, something along that line so that you can see in your orchestrator logs, if you have access to those, the log messages and what the bot's calculating. I use the log messages all the time because I don't like being blindsided. All right. Questions about debug before I go into the other parts we're going to talk about tonight, or about process design? I will take your silence as acceptance. Let's remove our toggles. Just right click on it. We're going to toggle and we'll right click again. We're going to toggle again. And so we would do that on all of our toggles. Okay. That's how you would remove your toggles. And you know, guys, it's not unreasonable to toggle everything if you're going into debug. If you know something doesn't need to be toggled, you don't need to. But there's nothing wrong with toggling everything in debug, because then you can look in the locals panel when you're debugging and you can see what that's doing. You can see what your automation is doing, what it's capturing, what it's not capturing. Okay. I'm going to throw one more toggle in here. We're going to go back into the debug panel real quick, and I'm going to set that debug guy going. And we'll get him to stop here at, started him from the wrong place again. I do that all the time. Sorry about that. Let's debug him here. Until he stops. Okay. Your call stack. That's the processes you're running through. And your breakpoints. This is the breakpoints that you had. Okay. So if I had installed more breakpoints, they would be listed here. All right. This is on this side, this is just your project information. While you're in debug, it's read only. Nothing you can do to change this until after it comes out of debug. You can't insert any activities or anything like that while it's in debug. Okay, you have to wait till it comes out of debug. And this is just the other stuff that you have when you're in your normal studio. Again, it's going to be all grayed out. You can't do anything while you're in debug. Okay. Okay. Any questions about this before we go on to other things? Okay. I'm going to stop that. We're going to go into, let me let it get released out of debug real quick. I'm going to turn off my toggles. All right. Let's go into data validation. So let's say I take this guy out. Okay. Or I'm coding, which happens a lot. No one's perfect. Sometimes we've named our data table down here in our variables. And guys, one thing you want to always remember is when you're setting up a new data table, you want to initialize it. Some people do it here. I do it here. Some people will do an assign and initialize it in an assign. You want to make sure your data table is initialized, especially if you're using more than one data table in your automation. Because if your data tables are not initialized, the bot may not be able to interact with those data tables. Okay. Let's go up here and we're going to analyze our file. We're going to click here and we do this. I do this when I'm done building for that period. I do it each time I close my automation, before I check it into any type of DevOps, before I publish it to my non-prod environment. I'm going to do an analyze file. I'm going to validate my project. And even though we took that DT out, it doesn't show any errors, right? So that's not always going to be the correct thing to do. So if I were to say today's date and I analyze that, it's going to give me an error. Okay. Now, sometimes if you have a lot of code going on, especially if you're doing a flow chart decision, flow decision, you may forget to put the condition in there. And like you saw here, the bot's not always going to find where you forgot to name something or where you missed something. That's what we're going to do when we get into Workflow Analyzer. But you can see, you can double click on that and it'll take you to where it's going to highlight where your error was. And I can say, oh, I forgot to put the date now. Okay. So now if I analyze my project, validate my project, it will then give me no errors. But I know that I still don't have a DT here. I have a DT coming into here, but where's DT? Well, it's not finding DT because DT is named down here. So to the bot, there is no DT. There is a DT. It's right here. It's a variable. You have it named. Okay. So, but if I took that guy and I named him DT1, and then I validated my project, it should come up with and it did not come up with an error. I think I just outsmarted the bot. Isn't that nice? Let's put that back to DT. And let's put DT in here. Well, let's wait. Okay, that's just validating your project. Validating a file would be you'd be validating this guy. Okay, or this guy, or this guy, or this test. That's validating a file. Validating your project validates from main all the way through, okay, your entire project. Let's go into what we call Workflow Analyzer. But before, we're not going to go to it here yet, okay? We're going to go, and we want to go over here. We want to right-click on this. We want to click on Project Settings. Project Settings. You can, if you're familiar with your code, let me just show you something here. And I'm going in and I'm reading my range or my Excel application scope, and I'm familiar with what's all over here, right? Or I'm going into a UI or a user interface or a browser or something like that. Then I know that here like this instant cache period or something along that lines, I can set it here in my properties panel, or it may be a delay before a click, a delay after a click. It may be a timeout period. It may be simulate click. It may be simulate type. It may be use send Windows message or something along that lines. You can define it over here. Okay. And this will always override this panel. What you define over here will always override what you have in project settings. Always. Okay. As long as this is not named, if it's blank, project settings takes precedence. Okay. So the first thing we want to go into when we go look at project settings is I don't use the modern design experience. This is going to, I'm not going to reload it. This is many times the newer versions of UiPath 2022 and above will default to modern design experience. I don't use modern design experience. Modern design experience does not allow for data scrapes. So I always toggle mine off. You might want to make sure that that's toggled off if you're in a newer version. PIP is a picture in picture. We don't use that because we don't use attended at Mary Kay. You may use attended. Supports persistence, long running automations, starts in background. Again, that's going to be unattended, and disable pause, that's unattended. That all has to do with unattended when someone wants to go in and pause their automation so they can do something on their desktop. Okay. First thing we're going to do is we're going to look at system project settings. Add data column. Allow on DB null. Do you want to allow blank rows or blank cells into your database? Yes. By default, it's going to be true. If you don't want to allow that, you need to check it here, or you can check it into your project settings over here when you're doing a database. Auto increment is always going to be set to false. Read text file, write text file. I don't get into a lot of these. This is going to show what it's going to default to when you start your filter data table. If you'll notice at the top, it says keep or remove. It's defaulting to keep because I have it set to keep. Okay. Log messages. I'm at info. If you want to go to trace, you're going to eat up a lot of space. Your automation is going to run slower. Most of us default to info, and defaulting to info means we get info and above. Defaulting to trace means we get trace and above. If you just want errors and warnings in your log messages, you would click here, you get that above. Okay. Most of us and most developers will default to info because we put log messages in again, so we can see page transitions, calculations, things like that. Retry scope is the other important one I want to show you all. It's going to default to 3 values. If you've ever used a retry scope, it will ask you how many times you want to retry something before the bot gives you an error message that says, I cannot perform the actions that you've asked me to do. I think it's something along that line. Default is 3. I usually change this to 1. Okay. Computer vision, we don't use OCR. We do use OCR. I'm not going to get into that, but I'm not using modern. I'm going to use classics. Let's jump into the classic part and let's scroll up on your project settings. Okay. These are your default settings. There's an automatic default of 200 milliseconds before each thing that your bot does. You don't see it, and it's going to be blank over in your properties panel. And it's going to be the same as debug. Now, if you're working with a large data set in debug, I usually change the debug value to 100 because it goes fast, because debug generally is trace. It's trace logging, and it's going to give you everything. It takes forever. Also, if you're working with a large data set debug, you want to give the bot a sample of that data set to debug. If you have a lot of data in debug, your bot's going to take forever to debug. Okay, so you want to reduce the size of that data set just so you're comfortable with what the bot's doing. On the run values, I usually leave these as they are, the defaults, but I will sometimes change my debug values. Timeout is always going to be set to 30 seconds or 30,000 milliseconds. Wait for ready. This is going to be on your UIs, on your selectors, your clicks, and things like that. Your type intos, things like that. It's going to be it's defaulting to interactive, unless on your panel you're changing it to wait for ready to complete or wait for ready none. It's defaulting to interactive because that means that that selector, whether the rest of the pages come up or not, that selector can be played with now. So it defaults to interactive. Alter of disables, always going to default to false. I do sometimes change this. That means a portion of your selector, not the entire selector, a portion of your selector may take longer to appear or longer to come into play, and you've got that portion of your selector into your selector choices. Browser, you can default your browser. This is going to default to IE because UiPath was built on a Microsoft platform, so it's going to default to IE. We all know IE is being sunsetted, so we typically default to Chrome. Okay, that's what we have Mary Kay do. We don't do the privates, new sessions. It's always going to default to true. Hidden's always going to default to boss. Let me see if there's anything else I need to show you on here. Data scraping will not appear in your modern. I think that's it. Send keyboard events. Okay, keyboard events. Send Windows message. It's always going to be, all these are always going to be defaulted to false because the assumption is you're going to set that when you're working with your UIs, your click activities, your type into activities, your other activities that you're using in a UI. You can set the send Windows message to true. Remember, send Windows messages interacts with the DLL, and it is going to be less effective, less consistent as simulate type. However, if you're working in Chrome, and especially starting in January 2023, you may have some problems with simulate type. So you want to start playing with send Windows messages or hardware events. Hardware event just simply means the bot's using your keyboard. Send Windows messages not clicked, and simulate type click is not clicked. That just means the bot's defaulting to using the keyboard or the mouse. Empty field, I always empty my field before I start typing into, whether historically there's nothing in the field or not, because you never know when something may default in there. So I will always change this to true and simulate type. Generally, I leave this blank because I do run into some issues in Chrome. Now, having said this, when we set these things, you can set, now if you set this, it's project settings. This is your project. You can set this globally. Your enterprise, your architecture team could set this for every automation. You can set these as defaults for every automation. So whenever anybody opens up an automation in your organization, these default values that you've set up with your teams, your developer teams and your system admin teams and your architecture teams, whoever's involved with your UiPath, your RPA experience, you can set these globally so you don't have to worry about these. Otherwise, you get to set these for every automation, all right? I'm not, Excel business, we're not going to go into, but then let's get into Workflow Analyzer. Workflow Analyzer is a set of UiPath best practices that UiPath set up for developers. And UiPath was very generous in doing this for us. I don't know if in your organizations, when you're building, you're going through what we call a code review. At Mary Kay, we have peer code reviews, and then we have department lead code reviews. So if someone in the finance group was building an automation, they would have to sit with me and do a code review. And that means I'm going to look at their code. I'm going to validate their code. I'm going to process their code against Workflow Analyzer. I'm going to check and make sure everything's labeled, everything's annotated, that I understand what their code's doing without really knowing what the automation may be doing or may not be doing. It's a code review. We do peer code reviews with each other. And in my case, when I build something, I also do a code review with a friend of mine that's in another department or another COE. So we're always checking our code because at Mary Kay, at least, we have global development standards. Everybody has to follow the same rules. And so we want to make sure that everything does follow those same rules, because if we set up the rules, that means we know that it's efficient and it's consistent and the fault risk is very light, okay? These are the best practices. If we check on one of these, it's going to open up the docs for UiPath. It'll explain what this best practice means. I'm in my server, so it may take a while. It'll explain what the best best practice means for this particular item. Okay. Now you can set these down as info. Some of them are defaulted, or you can set them as errors. Now at Mary Kay, again, these can be set up globally instead of project-wise. At Mary Kay, if we have errors, as you can see, if we have errors, we are not able to publish this to our source control or our orchestrator environment until those errors are handled. And when you analyze your project, we're not going to find any on this, but I'll show you what it does. It'll show your errors down there really in the same fashion it showed our error for our variable when we took out the now. And you can click on those errors. It will take you to where that, and you need to fix that before you can publish that. Again, we set these up globally at Mary Kay. Some of the big ones that we make sure, multiple flowchart layers, flowcharts within flowcharts within flowcharts. Okay, you're inviting a lot of risk for fault. That's why we use these guys. That's why we use, let me cancel this real quick. That's why we use these containers. We create code containers instead of multiple flowcharts within flowcharts within flowcharts. You're going to have a lot of problems if you do that. Okay. High arguments count. If I have a lot of arguments in my arguments panel, that means I probably should have some things, more things in my config file than in my arguments panel. Okay. That to us is an error. We only warning on hard code timeouts. That means I've changed the timeout over on this side and to override my project settings. I have an empty workflow. Sometimes we will put workflows that are not connected to our start node or anything else within our workflows that we've changed and we've updated, but we want to keep the old code out there for reference. So we'll unhook it from our start node or from any other sequence or anything in our flow chart. And that's just a warning to us. Persistence activities checks. And here's the activity name defaults. Okay. We have it at warning. That means if you have an assign and you just leave it as a sign, and then you do another sign and you leave it as a sign, and that's going to kick out this warning. Okay. Nested if clauses. That means you have an if within an if within an if. Those should all be separate ifs, or they should be flow decisions. Again, you're increasing your risk for fault with nested if clauses. Okay. We write line usage. That means that in your code, you've got a write line. Before you publish it, you may have put it there for your purposes when you're running in developer testing, whatever, that should be taken out. Your write line. It does not stop the automation from running. It creates an unnecessary log message, but we take write lines out. We replace them with log messages if we need log messages. Let me see what else we have for errors at Mary Kay. Definitely secure strings. That means we're using some credentials of some type from our orchestrator. Package restrictions, that means our packages are out of date and we need to add more packages. Required packages, that means we're doing something in our code that we're reading a PDF. We don't have the package for PDFs in there to read it. That's going to be easy to be found when you're over here trying to find your read PDF. You won't find it. Private file invoked. We don't allow private files to be invoked into our automations at Mary Kay because you're introducing the risk of corruption. You're introducing the risk of virus, malware, things like that into your things when you start allowing private files to be invoked into your automations. Well, you can invoke code, you can invoke C#, you can invoke VB, you can invoke all those, but you can't invoke a private file at Mary Kay. Container usage, Excel automation misuse. Some of these we have as warnings, okay? And some we have forbidden variables and selectors, things like that. We have them as errored out. So again, this is your project analyzer settings, okay? This is all of them. If you want to just narrow it down to workflow or you want to narrow it down to an activity, but at all, this is what we do. And this is how we default. We do this globally. And this helps prevent code review errors. It doesn't prevent us from doing code reviews. It just makes our code reviews much more specific, much more efficient, and much easier to do, especially when you have a large automation that has 10 or 15 of these segment containers in it. Okay. Now, in the newer versions, 2022 and above, when you do a validate project, when you do this validate your analyze your file, all of this is going to be done at the same time. Your workflow analyzer is going to be done, and your validate project is going to be done. So if we want to analyze our project, we would hit workflow analyzer, and this can take some time if you have a large object. Okay, we have a lot of stuff because I do this in here, but you can see we have a lot of warnings. Okay, and that's simply because I just threw this together really quickly today. Okay, and you can click on this. Oh, it's not my log messages that used here. You can see a lot of these are with my test workflow. Let's close that guy. It's still going to come up because I've have it in there, but we just get common superstore. Here we go. So you can see if you have a question about furniture DT doesn't have a data table prefix, that just simply says instead of furniture DT, best practice for it to say DT furniture. Okay. Instead of furniture DT. That's why we only have it as a warning. It doesn't prevent publication. It doesn't prevent us checking this into source code. If you had any errors, instead of warnings, it would prevent, at least at Mary Kay, we have set up so it prevents us from checking anything with an error into our source code or into UAT. Now, all these other ones, we generally, when we do a code review, we're going to run this guy. And if I was in a code review and I had all this, I'm going to get some questions. Why didn't you fix this? You need to fix this. Why doesn't it say DT furniture instead of furniture DT? Things like that. So this is part of our code review process. I don't know how your organizations do that, but we do that at Mary Kay. All right. And I think published orchestrator. If you want a published orchestrator and you're in a development studio and your studio bot, in my case, I'm hooked to a server. This server sits in my non-prod environment. So anything I publish goes into non-prod and not prod. So it follows our project lifecycle. We build, we test in non-prod before we deploy to prod. Okay. So I'm not sure how some of you have yours set up, but that's how Mary Kay has it set up. And that's how UiPath used to, when you bought the studio, and I don't know if they still do it, it's been so long since we bought studio licenses or bought the orchestrator or the enterprise thing. You get orchestrator, you get however many unattended bots you purchase, and then you get a studio, a non-prod environment, non-prod orchestrator. And used to be, we get a free non-prod bot. I think they're like $100 now. So you can have more than one. It used to be free, but it would come with it. So that's when we published that into our non-prod environment, and we went over project settings. That's a lot of information in 50 minutes. So anybody have any questions? Well, that was
Here's a question. Curious as to why you don't let check into source code with errors.
Because the way source control works. Okay, so let's say we check in our initial, we start a build from ground up and we finish for the day. We're not done with our automation. We check it in. Okay. Then the next day, the way most source control works, the next day we're going in and we're doing more work. When we check that in, it's only checking in the changes we made, right? It's not rechecking in your whole automation. It's only checking in what you changed that second day you were working on it. And so that goes into your source control. That's why it's called source control. So you have your basic, then you're checking in the layers of changes that you've made. So if your basic has a bunch of errors, you don't go back out there and correct those errors. I mean, those errors, then you're checking in subsequent changes to your source, to your original source with errors. So at Mary Kay, we don't allow any check-ins with errors because that way we know the next day you're working on it, right? That original or whatever, however many levels that you've checked in already have no errors. So we're just building upon an error-free code sequence, okay? So when we then check that into our production environment, we can check in all those change set IDs at one time and know that they're all error-free because we don't allow it to go any other way. Now, warnings, we can check in with warnings because that's just a warning to us as developers. Those are usually going to be solved when we do our code reviews. And then we check that back in because we made changes and we've cleared those warnings, okay? Does that answer the question?
That makes sense. Normally we catch those at publish.
Yeah. And that's it, Diane. It's been a pleasure for the last, 4 sessions, Diane? I appreciate you allowing us the venue to do this. Again, if anybody has any further questions, I know I'm working with a couple of people that have contacted me outside of these sessions on other things. So if anybody has any other questions, you can feel free to reach out to me by email and I'll answer however best I can or find you the answers if I can't find them.
Yeah, we have one more comment. Now I see I could be using the analyzer to help in code reviews as well.
Sure.
Thanks for sharing this. So one more chance, everybody can unmute themselves if they want. You have any questions? Okay.
Oh yeah, I have.
Go ahead.
How could I build or create a new rule for the work analyzer?
A new rule for your workflow
analyzer? The analyzer project.
Can you create a rule for workflow analyzer? You know, I don't know the answer to that. I'll find out though. I honestly don't know the answer to that, if you can or not. Let's look at it and see. I don't know. I will have to do some research and find out. We have never added any. We just go by the UiPath best practices. I'll have to find out for you. I don't know the answer to that. If you can drop your email address in the chat or something, Diane will send it to me. And when I find out, I'll let you know.
Yep, that'd be great.
Thank you.
No problem.
Any other questions? Well, thank you everybody for joining tonight. And Chris, thanks again for running this session. It's been really helpful to a lot of people. So
no problem.
The recordings will be available tomorrow. And if you have any questions, you have both mine and Chris's email addresses in the chat. So please just reach out to us. Thanks so much.
Thanks, Diane.
Thank you.